We are live. Stats dropped. We are live for another weekly meeting for EMEA and America is new diffs architecture workflow discussion. And I'll start right in. Patrick, who's not attending, a bit late for him. He added an answer to question from Stanislav in last week's call. So the question was for backend, could we serve syntax highlighted diffs in chunks, i.e. only the ones we request? Then he said, wait, is that his response? Stas, do you want to help out here? So this is his response, right?
Yep. Patrick confirmed that we actually can serve diff files one by one, and we don't have to highlight everything before we can do that. So that is really good to hear.
Okay, and then he has some follow-up questions. Are we thinking of loading 5 to 10 diffs along with the page render in HAML? Maybe. Right. I think that's an open question. I think one thing is becoming clear is that, so let me just write this down. One thing is becoming clear. We'll need to decide what is the between prioritized data and postponed data. This is really bad names, but so essentially, what is the critical data we need to first render the diff? Progressively, we'll load more data to conclude the render of the diff. And this is also coming up in the discussion below with Gitaly. Also potentially loading first a certain. Oh, I mentioned the word Gitaly and Justin joined. Hi, Justin. I'm hoping you can hear us. So we were just talking about how it's becoming clear that we need to have a decision between prioritized data and postponed data. First, the data that it's critical to render the diff, then progressively we'll load more data as we need to conclude the render of the diff. So which data, what kind of data is in these two sets is kind of like undetermined at this point. It could be that, like the first 5 or 10 diffs on a diff. Sorry, 5 or 10 files in a diff, let's put it that way. But even then, like if the first file is a huge patch, like thousands and thousands of lines of a patch, then we're still going to bump into some performance issues, I guess. So we'll have to be a little bit smart about how we decide that. But yes, that's my answer now. Anyone wants to add anything to Patrick's question? No. Hey, Natalia.
Since I jumped in kind of late, I just caught you were mentioning that there was concerns around super large files being diff. We do set on Gitaly's side a upper limit for the size of a file that is diff. So I think right now it's set to 50 megabytes. And so anything larger than that, we just don't attempt to diff. Gitaly treats it as a binary file. So no diff is returned.
So is that a limit of the file size or a limit of the patch or the diff?
That is a limit of the file size itself.
Got it.
So not we
do need to load it to syntax highlight and then get the. So that chunking, I guess it's done part in Rails, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know currently the commit diff RPC is capable of streaming back the singular large patch between revisions, and so that gets streamed back. But I don't know how the Rails side handles that. If you guys wait till you get everything back from the stream.
I don't know either. Carrie, Igor, any ideas? Or we should look into that and discuss synchronously.
Yeah, probably we should, but could you please repeat the question?
So commit diff RPC from Gitaly is able to stream the patch that we're working with. Justin is just not sure whether the Rails is handling that as a stream, or I guess that's the question.
The quick answer is no, because Rails loads everything into memory. Yeah, we like handle the stream, but anyway, we build it up like into memory, and then we send it to front end. So whether it's streamed or not, Rails cannot use it for performance improvement, for performance optimization. Yeah, to be honest, yeah, why I got distracted, I tried to check whether the front end loads. I see that maybe I can quickly share my screen. Just a second. I see that front end permission needed from the host. Yeah, I send request. Yeah. So I see that we progressively load the diffs, right? The scroll is larger here. When I scroll, it becomes smaller. So my question is to front end, to whether we load it on demand, but at the same time, when I try to command F, something that is down below, it works like correctly. So probably we don't need to implement the thing that to be honest, that I hate on some website is a custom command F. Yeah, probably we don't need to, but
Sure.
My question to front end, whether we load it like on demand or not.
So that's a great question. I'm sure others will have other thoughts. As front end load things on demand. We iterate throughout the whole diff to load everything ahead. And again, we have to think about the current implementation and the next stage, which is the new diffs implementation. What we have learned, though, is the virtual scrolling is not a long-term solution. It causes a bunch of problems. So what we do is we don't put everything on the page at once at the moment, which doesn't support the command F natively. What we do, which is a trick that we're not very proud of, but it works, is that when you do command F, the app detects that and applies everything on a page at the moment. So that could potentially lead to some performance, like, some freezes in there. That's why you didn't notice that, but we don't do that. What we have been discussing for a long time is that if we can prioritize loading the non-syntax highlighted content of the files, we can dump that on the page much quicker and potentially a lot lighter. So we can keep those pieces of content on the page until the user sees them. And when the user sees them, we could potentially load the highlight at that moment. So that's why we talk about prioritized data and non-prioritized data, is that some of the things we need to render, we don't need to go deep into it until the user sees it. But we do need to have, so for example, this is something that we want to allow for searching, but we don't need the buttons of actions to be added to the page until the user sees that, right? We don't do that at the moment. Well, part of virtual scrolling we do, but we don't have that sort of like smartness yet. But the new diffs is something that we're actively considering to do. I don't know if I covered everything, Stanislav, Thomas, Phil, chat.
I want to mention that we load all the data that is needed for the merge requests as soon as possible. So it's not loaded as you scroll through the files. It's loaded in the background, and as soon as you see the file, we start rendering it, but the data is already there. So if you're asking if we load stuff on demand, no, we do not.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Then, yeah, but backend, just to mention, backend highlights when we have backend highlight, yeah, when you load the data, backend responds with already highlighted data. So yeah, if we want to optimize there, then yeah, we need to probably load it on demand or consider some other solutions to optimize highlight on backend, which we discussed already regarding doing it line by line and making sacrifices on the correctness. Or yeah,
that's a whole discussion that we're going to have to go down that rabbit hole at some point. Okay, so that's the question about front-end loading things on demand. Then he has another question. What does it mean when you say REST will be streamed? Do you mean like SSE, server sent events? What will be streamed? Stas? Stanislav?
That's a big question. I think we need to separate server side and client side here. So on client side, it can be streamed as like adding symbols as soon as we fetch them. So as soon as you fetch the HTML, it's inserted as text. So that can speed up things a little bit. If for example, you have a very large chunk of a diff, like 0.5 MB, it can take quite some time to fetch this file from the network. So what we can do is start rendering it immediately as soon as we fetch these bytes. And streaming helps with that on the client. The second part of this is server side. So is it Patrick asking the question? So Patrick asks, is it like SSE? In fact, it doesn't matter what the underlying transport we are using. It can be SSE, it can be WebSockets, it can be just simple XHR, it can be anything. We've tested it using fetch and like a regular HTTP request. Nothing fancy. So it can work with Rails approach because, as you've already told, as Igor told us, that Rails is not really stream friendly. It cannot like direct one stream to the client. So it has to be buffered, but that's unfortunate, but we can work around that. We can use pages, for example, as we do right now. We use batches of files and we can stream these batches as well.
So I'm sorry if I am interjecting with information and asking questions about information I should have already. Is the idea that we're going to change and like remove the highlighting step from the back end then and stream directly from Gitaly? Because otherwise, like I guess the root question is, do we even know what's slow? Like, is that the problem? Is the problem getting from Gitaly into Rails? Is the problem Rails
I think
things?
When I was exploring into SSR, I identified two main things that are really slow. The first thing is slow is on the backend, which is highlighting, which we are all aware of. And the second one is rendering on the client. So rendering, I don't know, 200 diffs on the client can take some time. So streaming helps with that. It helps rendering files as soon as you, first of all, load them and render them progressively. So you don't render 200 files at once, you render them file by file, for example.
Okay, because I was under the I thought that highlighting was done asynchronously, so its speed is out of band. So
I think the question, Carrie, is that I think
I'm trying to catch up. Sorry.
I was thinking. I think it's important here because I think at this point we require the files to be highlighted to be served to the front end. I think so. Whenever we get that data, it's always highlighted, so it does take more time. The open question that we don't know the answer to yet is whether we should support a lightweight version of that request that would skip that step, allow us to put that content on the page much quicker and lighter, so to sense, because if you don't have the markup for the highlights, it's much less DOM nodes that we might not actually need if the user doesn't scroll to them. So there's a couple of like improvements and benefits of doing it that way. And then at a later stage, when we do request it, potentially the backend could have had that already cached. That's a little bit more of a different approach, but yeah, the approach, I think one of the things I wanted to say here is that this also will depend a little bit on the approach of the front end that's not particularly decided. So one of the questions we have open here below for the agenda today is to have a little discussion about server-side rendering, what we have learned about it and how we've thought about employing that in this context, and we want to hear everybody's thoughts. If that's valid, then we need to think about a different way, because then the performance prioritization needs to happen on the Rails side before it gets to the front end, and then the front end completes the work with the completion of the render of the app. Because the question could be the server-side rendering could be partial. You can only serve a certain part in server-side rendering to get it quickly to the user, and then from that moment on, the front end takes care of the rest. So yeah, all of that is a bit of an open question.
Sorry for the derailing. I apologize.
Oh, no, it's good because I mean, Justin just joined on that, so I think it's very useful for him to hear our thoughts too. So thanks for taking those out of us. Great. I'm going to move on for the next one because I think it's pretty much all in the same kind of topic. So Patrick had this question in the APAC agenda, but he doesn't think it was answered. I don't think either. So one question I have for the front-end engineers is, what properties do we require for the front end to display diffs? And he's asking because diffs-patch.json currently includes other data that is not about diff files, thinking that if we can move those other data to a different endpoint and have an endpoint specific for diff lines, we can reduce the amount of data we serialize. And he says the serialization is one of the slowest parts of diffs-patch.json request and make caching a bit more effective. And then he says, I'm thinking we can focus on just including the highlight diff lines in the response, and anything else is added separately so we can display diffs faster since we get the data faster. And that, I'll repeat what I said. I think this will depend on the approach of the front end, but it is aligned with a realization we had, a lesson we had about diff lines are cacheable across users. So it's static content, right? So it's one of those things that we can cache it for everybody that's accessing that version of the AMER without risking like permissions checks. I guess if you had, I mean, there is one permission check overall if they have permission to that AMER and to that diff, not just the AMER. But from that moment on, the diff content doesn't change from user to user. The comments might change, or the way we render those comments might change a little bit here and there, but the markup of the content of the diffs are not different. So yes, that's one of the things we've thought about, is to isolate that part and make that stand on its own. Whether it's a separate endpoint or just a separate process, it depends on how we actually render the front end, server-side rendered, streamed, whichever, GraphQL endpoints and stuff. So we definitely have to get deeper into the front end approach before we can update that. I will add, before I pass on to another thing, we already do have the diffs metadata endpoint that does serve the point of diff lines information. I think. I don't know. What does everybody else think? Any more thoughts on that?
I think it all depends on the architecture that we decide to use, because we can even skip the whole API part and fetch the diffs already rendered as HTML and integrate all the data into the HTML itself. So this is not something we should decide before building our architecture.
Sure, we'll get deeper into that discussion then. What we can tell the backend though, and Patrick in particular, that isolating diffs is also something we're looking into as a data component sort of thing, and potentially prioritizing or making it easier to cache that across the board much quicker, and not have that be grow stale as quick. So that's that. As for the what individual data, I think we can have a discussion about it, but it's still early, and this segues really well for the next discussion with Gitaly side. Anybody has any thoughts on this question from Patrick before I move on? Talking a lot today. Sorry. All right. Next one, and I'll pass this over to Justin a little bit, but I wanted to highlight here some changes that are being discussed on the Gitaly side. Justin summarizes really well the discussion that happened above it. So I invite you all to take a read of that. Oh, there's a new issue, Justin, is that it?
Yeah, I created a new issue that was basically just an extension of that summary. So just kind of we're able to separate out the conversation there. And I go into a little bit more detail about our motivation for the change.
Great. And for those here, just like we've been talking about paginating things between Rails and front end, this is sort of like a very similar and familiar discussion between Gitaly and Rails. Yeah, thoughts on that? Everybody has thoughts on that? If you haven't read that, the idea is then to get first the change paths on that diff, what was the changes for each path, and then the client or Rails would then request the information for each individual change path, I guess. In a nutshell, I think that's kind of what's been discussed. Ideas, thoughts? I mean, I want it to not be me again.
Does everyone kind of understand the approach, or because I can give like a quick, little bit more in-depth overview of it if people aren't familiar with, haven't had a chance to read it
I
yet.
in no way have read your entire issue, so sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, is there a
Yeah, just the quick summary would be that from Gitaly's perspective, the computing diffs doesn't necessarily scale well, depending on two factors. The size, one mentioned earlier, was the size of a file being diff. If it's too large, that can cause timeouts. We can solve that easily by just setting a limit on the Git side to not compute those diffs. But the other issue is if between the set of revisions is a large amount of files, this can also take way too long. So today, how the RPC commit diff is structured is it just computes the entire diff for a given revision, and then it gets streamed back. But the actual Git operation itself is just done in one go, and so that can cause timeouts. So what we're looking to move towards is it shifts a little bit more of the burden to the client of saying, okay, the client will first request information about like a summary of the entire diff that's going to be performed. So it'll basically return all the changed paths, the blob ID before and the blob ID after. And then the client can then dictate to Gitaly which files it actually wants to get diffs for. So it says, okay, I want diff for this file, this file, this file, and basically passes the blob ID before and after. So it's actually really computing the diffs on a given blob. And it gives much more flexibility to the client to decide which diffs actually want to be loaded at any given time.
Thanks, Justin. I'll add my notes. One, I think this aligns really well with the discussion we just had about prioritized data, non-prioritized data. So if we get the change paths, that would allow, I mean, if it gets to the front end, we're rendering things on the front end directly, it would allow us to kind of like start preparing the file tree, the skeleton of the diff, without the lines yet, but it could start giving hints on the front end on what's coming down their way. And then the other part, you mentioned the client could pass to Gitaly a list of blob IDs. One of the things we've looked at is if we can immediately from the get-go support a batch of blob IDs, I guess, to be served, it would be really helpful than having to go one by one. I don't know if that's already what you've covered, but I want to make sure that we mention that.
Yeah, I think the original idea was just for an RPC, single RPC per file, but that is something we could explore, is having a batch, so you could specify a set of blob IDs and then kind of chunk it in actual batches. We'll have I'm gonna have to do some digging to see, because I don't know if it may ultimately on the back end still have to be an individual Git process per file that gets done, because I don't think Git supports batching of blob IDs, of blobs, diffs, but might be something we might want to upstream. So we'll have to look into that.
No, that makes sense. It does beg the question for me, because is Gitaly able to preemptively? So here's something that's been on our minds for a while. When we ask for the first batch of the diff, we know by inference that the next 5-10 batches will come right after that, right? If Gitaly or Rails wait for that request to come in, that's time that we could have been computing the following batches. Is that something that it's feasible on the Gitaly side to anticipate and cache that in some way, or caching should be on the Rails side?
I think caching should be on the Rails side, probably, because from the viewpoint of Gitaly, in at least this architecture, it really has no idea of what to anticipate next. It could really be anything. It could be any arbitrary blob, as far as I see right now.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Because for Rails, we're in the context of a merge request, and we kind of like already know what's in there. They're a little bit more isolated, small, granular RPCs. This brings me to another question. The reason why we're getting the big blob files over to Rails, and backends, please correct me if I'm wrong, is to do like syntax highlighting, or at least one of the big reasons for diffs is we have to get the whole file, to highlight it, and then chunk it and serve it to the front end. And might be a silly, maybe not so silly question. Is syntax highlighting at all possible on the Gitaly side in any way, or is that just out of the question?
I don't think we could do it on our side without on the Gitaly side without. I guess we can. Maybe the request could be the response could be modified of some sort. I don't know, and I think that the team might have questions of whether or not that would belong on our side.
Yeah, I know Gitaly really wants to be that pure, right? The pure access step.
Yeah.
Would there be a space for, like, I mean, in a perfect world where we didn't have to worry about anything, like a specialized service that sat in between to do that highlighting, and that was all it did?
You kind of read my mind, Scary. I was like, yeah, we don't want to get Gitaly bloated for sure. We want that to be very nimble. But maybe this is a case that, I mean, we do syntax highlighting for a bunch of contexts. And when we think about, I'm trying to think, given the specific SHA, the commit that we're looking at, or the blob IDs versions, just trying to think about reusability in other contexts. Not sure it would, but yeah, I from my side, that would be great.
I mean, if we can get performance improvements from not having to deal with Rails streaming limitations, plus whatever overhead Ruby's giving us, at a former employer, we did diff highlighting with Haskell in its own Haskell service, but that was a different architecture. So,
and especially we can use different technology, different languages, all that stuff.
Yeah, and if we're moving towards the Gitaly architecture of having to coordinate, multiple RPCs, having an independent service that could even handle caching, all in that layer could be quite nice.
Justin, the problem would still be there of getting the large blobs to that service, right? So there's no shortcutting that.
Yeah. So, well, when you say large blobs, are you saying ones that are like over the limit, or
no? So from what I understand, this discussion comes from bandwidth problems or just large files coming through the pipeline between Gitaly and the clients. What I'm trying to see is this restructuring of change paths first and then the blobs, IDs, and everything. That would still be necessary if we put the service in front. It would just make the lives easier of everyone later.
Yeah,
the workflow.
Yeah, it would still be necessary to do that on our end, just to avoid the crux of it is too many files being diffed at once. It can scale infinitely depending on the shape of the repository. But yeah, I think an external service could help aid in maybe coordinating and abstracting away some of the burden of having to coordinate all those RPCs in some way and present it as just cache data that's available on demand.
Okay, thanks.
Just one note. Yeah, I had like a couple of thoughts. Yeah, I thought that they are crazy, but since we are discussing a separate service, maybe I should say it out loud. For example, we're using like Workhorse to perform direct RPC calls. For example, when you download a blob, just a raw blob, Workhorse actually performs a Gitaly RPC call and gives a response to user, avoiding this like large size traffic, avoiding sending it through Rails. Yeah, so maybe it's something to consider. For example, if we implement syntax highlight on the front end side, yeah, maybe we could load like raw diffs using Workhorse and then highlight them on the front end. Yeah, it's just a raw idea. Maybe it doesn't work, but maybe it's something worth considering. But as we've discussed before, I mentioned it that, for example, we not only load like commit diff RPC, we also load the whole blob, like the old version and the new version of each blob, and it's actually have these performance implications. So if we decide to move to that approach, implementing syntax highlight on the front end, then probably this logic should be also like mirrored as well. Yeah, that front end should also load the old and new version of the diff in order to.
When you say front end, you're talking the browser, right?
Yeah.
That's the approach that we've kind of like sort of discarded a bit, just from the sheer like physical reality, right? If you have a 5 megabyte file that has a one line change, we'll be transferring 10 megabytes of those, like the old and the new, just to get that in front end. And potentially, if we don't do that, we'll have incorrect highlighting. So it's kind of like
so maybe regarding the incorrect highlight, maybe like we shouldn't make the sacrifice of not loading this old and new version at all, but maybe please just correct me if I'm wrong, maybe we could for example specify the line number, like we have the diff, the line change from 10 to 20, yeah, and we load like from 0 to 100 in order to something like extend the scope of the diff in order to guess maybe the diff will be correct. So my question to Justin, whether it's possible, what do you think, to send the two parameters like old line and new, maybe not old line, but start line and end line to Gitaly and receive like the part of the file, not the whole file?
Before Justin answers, just want to add context that we learned from the syntax highlighting on the front end on the blobs, is that unless you have knowledge of the structure of the language of the file, where you cut off, if you do that arbitrarily with like first previous 20 lines or previous 15 lines, you might cut it in a way that the highlighting will be off. You'll miss a class declaration, you miss a module or something, and that's specific to each language. And that's the hard part of partially highlighting files, is that you're easily going to get it wrong. But anyway, just wanted to add that there.
Yeah, you almost need to translate it into the syntax tree, right? And like figure out what your stop points actually are, even if they're outside of the section. You could get some benefit from it, but it would be really complicated. I think it'd be complicated.
I think it's worth adding that that is something we might be looking into at a later stage, especially when we're talking about comments and notes, or sort of discussions. We've briefly discussed the possibility of not doing it based on lines, but based on the syntax tree of the file, based on the knowledge of the language and everything. But that's the discussion for later on in the pipeline. Before it's just serving the data.
It can be also be like a large range. Yeah, for example, 1,000. Yeah, 1,000 maybe like 1,000 of lines, so 2,000 of lines probably would cover the like 80% of the cases, and maybe it would be like sufficient. But if it's not impossible, and Justin tell us that it's totally wrong, then nothing to discuss here.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I don't think there is a way with git diff to actually partially diff a file without having to compute the entire diff on a file. I'm pretty sure the smallest unit of a diff is going to be the entire file ultimately. So I'm like looking right now in the site. I don't know anything. I don't see anything that is, but I'll ask Patrick to confirm. But I'm pretty sure the file is going to be the smallest unit.
Sure. Okay, we'll keep this discussion in our minds and we'll see where that leads us.
And Igor, if we can think of it like offline, like if we can think of a way to prove it, like we should explore it and see.
Yeah, regarding the range or regarding the optimization or both. Yeah. Yeah, cool, sure.
Long-term future thinking, having an AST computed for the file would be really useful way out in the future because it would be great for us to be able to like on the front end leave a comment on just the parameters of a function, right? Like the user is like the names of these seem unclear or whatever, and not on the line, just on the parameters. So breaking something down to like a full AST would still be useful for like enhanced functionality in the future. But that's probably just adding more load rather than making it faster.
Thanks for mentioning it, Thomas. It's definitely relevant. It's just not for the single use of the highlighting. You could be having multiple uses.
Yep.
Yeah, it could be on the server side as well. Yeah, potentially has to be though, right? Because if you also need to know the whole file to do this, so we kind of like bump into the same problem of the syntax highlighting. Right.
It's all sort of mixed together.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I'll invite everybody to just join the discussion on that issue from Gitaly as well, just because those changes are being discussed at the moment. Adding the perspective of the clients, especially where we want it to be, is very beneficial for both Gitaly and our project. So that'd be great. Any outcomes here, or are we still just discussing? Any action points? Carrie, you mentioned something that we could potentially test to validate. Where was that? What was that comment? 1,000 line. There we go. Yeah. Maybe we can test to validate that. Yeah, we're definitely considering some POCs on the front end as well. So yeah, as long as it's not an app, it's definitely a POC. Bring this up to your manager, and if there's prioritization issues, tell them to talk to me a little bit to understand the context, and I can talk to Sean or Matt or Justin, I guess. You can send them my way. Cool. Last bit here, server-side discussion. So this has been on our minds for a very long time, about the server-side rendering of the diffs app. And Stanislav has worked on this proof of concept. So he has some code that renders the merge request diffs using this approach. And there's a little demo there. And he summarized the conclusions in a little comment that he linked there. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, and I invite you all to read the comment, or just scan it, read it diagonally for now. Later, read it word by word, of course. But there is one point here that at the very bottom, Stanislav does say that, however, this approach does not give significant performance improvements over time when compared to virtual scrolling, because virtual scrolling approach allows us to fully skip pre-rendering diffs. So what I want us to understand here is, how does server-side rendering sound to the backend? Because while we can duplicate the template and have the code be available in HAML or whatever in Rails side for the rendering of the data, the backend still needs to fetch the data from the source, whether Gitaly or database or Redis, wherever it is, and bring it over to the renderer as quickly as possible, even if it's partial. Remember, server-side rendering doesn't have to be full. It could be a partial server-side rendering and then hand it off to the front end to complete the job. So I wanted to hear thoughts from the backend and potentially Gitaly as well, on and potentially server-side rendered approach. The other part is that we could choose to not render the whole app in server-side rendering, just the diff lines. So yeah, just wanted to hear your thoughts on this approach, especially focusing on the backend, because the front end we kind of like already looked into it.
I think it's really potentially interesting. I guess the sticking point for me and other people who are more educated on this can, educate me, is what additional content would we be including in that rendering? Like, what's happening on the front end that should be pushed back to the server at this point?
I think we'll be pushing back everything that is static. So the only thing that comes to mind as of now is highlighted lines. And that's it, because everything else is usually interactive.
Yeah, we have a little bit files metadata, name, mode, perhaps stats, I don't know. So that's where the prioritized thing comes along, where we would only be server-side rendering the prioritized part of the information. The rest we can fetch later on. And I would try to think whether the diff stats would be a requirement or prioritized. It's really up for discussion, I guess, at this point. But yes, it'd be very lightweight. The diffs lines is where we particularly all agree that it would be pretty static and it would be pretty safe to do it server-side rendered. If we think about the whole diff as a whole, the diff file header, the name, the file content, the diff lines would be server-side rendered, and then the front end could add UI where it needed to be.
Yeah, I mean, if it's all static, I mean, Andre, I think I'm a huge fan of let's just render and cache everything that's static that we can, because we can do it out of bands. We don't care if we're not trying to react to user interactions. Then it's easy. We can just do it. We just throw a disk at the problem.
Even pre-calculating, which I know that's why you were hinting at that, but it's definitely something that we've entertained for a while now. Which I think it's also worth considering here. Like, all this work for the static content and all the stuff server-side rendered could be done not at the request of the render of the diff, but at the push or something like that, for like the most common cases, of course. And we're talking about a non-default branch, pre-calculating the diff between the non-default branch, the head of the non-default branch and the head of the default branch could be one optimization. And then from that moment on request would stay cached for all users. And I think that's an important distinction. Whereas today we don't do, from what I understand, a lot of this where we cache everything for every user. We usually put the user key in there, in the cache key and all that stuff. This would be a cache that would be reused through many users. For everybody in code review, There is the problem of the head always be changing, but once I think patch IDs will help us there, maybe. I'm not sure.
Speaking of cache, I think we can even justify using CDN cache because it will be just a simple HTML response. Nothing stops us from caching this one as well.
CDN, interesting.
No, Andre, you're totally right with patch ID. That will save us a lot of time, right? Because we only have as long as patch IDs are stable, then we've already calculated it and it's fine. And we only really need to calculate for, I don't have the exact numbers because I haven't studied the user behavior, but I mean, the vast majority of people are not picking through old versions on an MR. They're just looking at the most recent diff and moving forward. So, we're covered for, let's just say 98%, just pick a number of cases. And the remaining 2%, okay, we have to recalculate it maybe on the fly. And so they get the 3-second response, but then, hey, that's cached now. So that might be.
Thanks for helping the community. The next one will be quicker.
I also mentioned CDN cache because one of the big problems with our current cache is Redis. So we use a lot of Redis cache. And for example, if we move some of that to the CDN caching, we won't have to worry about it anymore. And that should free up some resources from our side, I think.
You mean actually actively push things out to the CDN before a request is made for it?
Like if all of our requests to this rendered HTML go through CDN, we can basically not care about caching and just leave it to the CDN part. Of course, it will have to be properly keyed. It would have to get a reliable cache key. If we can get that, we can offload it to CDN.
Well, patch ID would work for that as well, right? Because that's a unique identifier for that diff.
We would need to have
another use for it.
Yeah, we would need to have some way to invalidate. One of the discussions that always comes up in these things is that access can change. So private projects, putting it in the CDN puts it up for, we can use, security by obfuscation and all that stuff. But given the content that we're talking about here, we need to be very careful about that. Okay, so right now we're just at least discussing ideas. This is good to know, at least that. Does anybody see any roadblocks? Anything? Because I'll be completely honest and transparent. In the past, we moved everything from server things in the backend because we wanted to speed up perceived performance. The way we did that is we load the data synchronously, move it up to the front end, and now we're coming back. It just looks like the fat clients and thin clients all over again. And I think the important part here is that first render needs to be incredibly fast, which if we're talking about getting that data on the moment, it could be really challenging, I guess, for the backend to do that performantly. When we're talking about pre-calculating and making that available for everybody, might be a little bit easier to get those timings that we're looking for, which is in the milliseconds and not seconds. So something to keep in mind. You had a comment here, Stanislav, beneath?
Yes, to add a little bit of context to the discussion. So GitLab used to have that approach where we server-side rendered everything that we could, and we basically sprinkled JavaScript on top of it. So if we are speaking in terms of have we tried it? Yep, we have tried it, but I think the original idea was replaced by virtual scrolling and doing everything on client, because if you have a really large merge request, like 200 files changed, it will take a very long time for you to see even the beginning of the merge request, because it has to all to be buffered on the Rails side. So this approach is different from that because it tries to render as little as possible, but the meaningful part. So for example, first 5 diff files, so you can start reading the AMER, and it will progressively render the rest of the merge request. So that's a big difference from the previous approach. And that's why we're using streaming, because we want to progressively render stuff as soon as you fetch it, not wait for the whole thing to load before you can see it.
It's a great point. Thanks for that. Essentially, it's a hybrid approach, an enhanced approach from the past. If we do that, I'll suggest we call this project code name Back to the Future, or DeLorean or something. Yeah, I'm kidding. Cool. Thanks, Stanislav, for that. So we're definitely going to keep looking into this. One of the things I wanted to get, because we're getting close to the end, is taking some action points. So what should we do? I think one of the things is definitely to participate in the discussion of Gitaly. The discussion of Gitaly change. Gosh, I can't type Gitaly change. There was the potential invalidation of the syntax highlighting. Well, that was invalidated by not having a partial git diff. Validating the syntax highlighting with 1,000 lines before. If you can't get that from Gitaly, I think it's moot. Correct?
Yeah, I don't think we can do that with Git. We would have to compute the whole file anyways, and that would just be wasteful. We'd be throwing away when we recompute the next section.
Okay, so maybe we can invest that in that potential dedicated service for highlighting, as highlighting and caching, I guess. So open issue to investigate the viability of a dedicated service between Gitaly and Rails to facilitate syntax highlighting.
And as always, I think the asynchronous work there is just to kind of come up with some ways to like figure out how to prove it, you know, like how to test it and see if it would be, so that we're not committing to another flop, you know, between front and back end, whatever.
For sure. No, I think we don't plan for this effort to include shipped code, but we do plan for this to be validating our potential ideas. So that's what we're doing on the front end as well. That sounds a lot. Carrie, can I nominate you to open that issue and get that going? Get that started? Share it on the Slack channel, all that jazz. Cool. Amazing. And
Dustin, I'll share that over to you and the Gitaly team as well to contribute, because you might have more ideas too about how that would work. So,
okay, sounds good.
Amazing. On the server-side rendering, is there any action we can take here, or are we still in the meta world?
Yeah, I think we need to let it settle a little bit.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, because Stanislav you already have your POC, so I invite you all, especially the backend, to take a look at that code and potentially check it out and run it. I don't know how hard that is. We can potentially have an AMA for that particular thing, because I feel like it's important to really understand that approach to then potentially open up some other ideas on the backend that could make that avenue faster or just more performant. Slightly separate, but for now, just test the POC, test or get acquainted with the server-side rendering POC. So Stanislav shared a link to that POC in the comment that I linked there. Get acquainted. This will resurface again for us to talk about more in the future.
And maybe reply in the thread with like potential issues with that approach.
Igor?
Yeah, as Carrie mentioned, let's also test the solutions, ideas that we discussed today. Yeah, so it's about current optimization on the backend side, what if we do it through Workhorse, and what if we do it through separate service, just like keeping it in mind and see whether we have like the arguments for or against a particular approach. I think, yeah, we have a lot of food for thought after today's meeting.
Do you think that you can do that in that issue of the validation of the dedicated service, or do you need a separate? Can we do that there?
Validation dedicated service. If we have an issue with validation dedicated service, I can do it there. Yeah, great. I think a good place to like
it's part of the
weigh
same approach.
The arguments.
We're trying to find a solution for that, and then Workhorse could be like a pros and cons of that. So great. Once Carrie opens that, jump on that and share your thoughts.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Awesome. Great to see movement there. And that's it. We got to the bottom of it. Anybody has any other thoughts here? I want to thank everybody, especially Justin, for joining us. It's particularly useful to have somebody from Gitaly in these conversations. So I thank you for your time here. Thanks, Carrie, for making the time out of your very interesting traveling, and everybody else as well. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.